Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce George Osborne, who's here with us today at the Outernet in London for Groundbreakers 2024. So welcome, George. George was elected an MP in 2001, and I think at that point you were the youngest Conservative MP ever. Maybe you still are, I don't know.
No, got a bit older.
And was then appointed Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 2004. Following the 2010 general election, you were appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. You then left public office in 2017. You became editor of the Evening Standard, chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and also the British Museum. And I think you are still chair of the British Museum. And you're currently managing partner at 9 Yards Capital. So once again, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us here today. I've been out of the UK for 25 years, there or thereabouts. So I have lost touch a bit with the political scene, but in preparation for this interview, I was looking at what you've been up to lately. And I came across your podcast with Ed Balls, Political Currency. To be perfectly honest, not what I would normally listen to, but actually I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
So you now have a new follower. And I particularly enjoyed the Gordon Brown stint at the end of the last episode. So that was the sort of political climate that I remember. So what's it like doing a podcast with your political adversary?
Well, first of all, it's great being here at Groundbreakers, and it's actually great to have the conference here in London and in Europe. I know in the past it's been in the US, and great to work with Prologis. The podcast is a kind of political fix for me. I'm not in frontline politics anymore, but it gives me an opportunity each week with my opposite number, the person who, we were fighting to the death, the political death against, to talk about the events of the week, not just in Britain, but internationally, and try and explain how governments think and how politicians think. I mean, so often, and I've edited a newspaper myself, what you read is a sort of outside-in view on politics and politicians and governments. And my experience is that, a better way of trying to understand what's going on is to think of the motivations of a government or a politician or a regulator. There's no one in this room, listening to this who doesn't in some way touch upon government. And I always think a good place to start is, rather than being dismissive of government, and sometimes government can be really irritating, but instead to start with what are the legitimate motives of this regulator or this government or this administration or this individual? And in the podcast, I try and tease that out.
So you're frenemies, I guess.
We are frenemies, me and Ed Balls. I think in medieval times, I would have had him executed. Whereas in 2024,
we've moved on.
2024, I do a podcast with him. So things are improving in the world. Don't let those who say things aren't getting better put you off.
So down to business, and in particular, the supply chain, which we'll be discussing at length here. So Prologis has a platform of logistics across the globe, through which it's almost 3% of global GDP flows through our assets. So an efficient, stable supply chain is really critical for our customers to succeed. So in your view, what are the issues today and challenges facing the global supply chain?
So I think the first thing, for people to understand, it may seem like a statement of the obvious, but Prologis will know more about the supply chain than any government. And so governments are getting interested in supply chains from a position really of ignorance. When I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the number 2 here in the UK, the finance minister, sort of budget minister rolled into one. I didn't have to worry about where things were coming from in the world, with the possible exception of some very kind of elite military equipment. But if you put that to one side, I just assumed, as everyone else did at that time, that in a globalized world, the rare materials would flow, the iron ore would flow, the computer chips would flow, and the food would flow. That there was there was a little bit of contingency thinking if supply chains were disrupted, but often because of things like industrial action might disrupt fuel supplies, for example. But there was certainly none of the thinking that's currently going on in governments and in boardrooms about, what are kind of critical supply chains that we need to have control of. Are there certain jurisdictions we don't want to source from? Do we want to nearshore things? And it's a combination of, as of course everyone knows, kind of national security concerns as the world splits into a more kind of competing, arena of great powers, the United States, China, India, and so on. It's partly concern about jobs in domestic economies. Look at the US election where, both candidates are talking about bringing jobs back to America. But because it's become a kind of hotter political topic, and because boardrooms are very focused on their supply chains in a way they may not have been, or certainly in the security of their supply chains in the way they might previously have been only if concerned about the efficiency of their supply chains, doesn't mean, that suddenly government is smart about all these things, or that it can anticipate what the supply chain of the future is going to look like. Because, if you were doing this 20 years ago, you might not have focused on, some of the rare earth materials, for example, because you wouldn't have anticipated where mobile phone manufacturing would have gone. And governments, they're not to be underestimated, governments, and they wrestle with very difficult problems. But what they are terrible at, in my experience, is predicting the future. Because the future, particularly in this world of supply chains, is driven by innovation in companies, consumer demand, consumer trends, all sorts of things which, even the best companies in the world struggle to predict. And, who 5 years ago, apart from the people at NVIDIA, would have anticipated that there'd be such a demand from AI technology for a certain type of microprocessing chip. So, that's where I would just, there's a lot of talk of supply chains, but I still think there's quite a deficit of knowledge, particularly amongst the kind of political decision makers.
So do you think there's an opportunity, or do you think there's a need for the likes of Prologis, who has a lot of data, obviously, around supply chain? Would it be welcome for us to try and educate the sort of government in supply chain where we think it's going and how they can help us?
Yes, I think so, both for, well, first of all, you are an incredible store of probably unique data that's not, easily accessible for even a large government. Second, you can help on governments think through supply chains, and there might be bits of supply chains they just simply don't understand. I mean, of course, COVID was a sort of dry run for this.
Absolutely.
Suddenly, people realized you couldn't build a car if a microchip made in East Asia didn't arrive in time. And so the car plants in Detroit kind of start to freeze up. And no one had really anticipated that. They'd thought of cars as, steel and rubber and so on. So you can bring all sorts of information about where things are sourced from and, outsourced from. I think you can also help governments who are trying to think ahead, think through the kind of infrastructure they might need to be planning for the next 20, 30 years. Because in a Western democracy in particular, this will apply elsewhere in the world, but in a Western democracy, as we all know, kind of planning or permitting, it's called in the US, is what it is. There are attempts, for example, here in the UK to make it quicker, but these projects can't be delivered overnight. They take a long, long time to plan.
This is our number one pain
point. And anticipating, therefore, what's going to be needed in the future. I think you would have more insight into that than any kind of government department or central bank or statistical office.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to get closer to various government departments, whether it's in the UK or indeed across Europe or globally. For business leaders, it can be fraught with, well, one, it's quite a daunting prospect going into government, and we have to be very careful how we do that, obviously. But any counsel you can give business leaders as to, one, the benefits of sort of hand in hand with the government in terms of infrastructure, as you said, or investment, but also how to build those relationships and really how to foster those relationships?
I think the central thing I'd say as someone who was in the public sector in a senior position in government and now is in the private sector dealing with corporates and large, I deal with some of the largest companies in the world and also some of the smallest through our venture capital fund, 9 Yards Capital, is, put yourself into the shoes of the regulator or the government department or the government official or the politician. I think sometimes there's a tendency in the private sector to sort of dismiss them as just annoying or, an obstacle to business. By the way, it's just as bad the other way. But if you try and understand, well, what are the incentives on this regulator? What are its legitimate objectives that it's trying to achieve for society? And how can we help them meet their legitimate objectives whilst at the same time making life easier for ourselves? So I was thinking, I was a finance minister, I look in financial services, a regulator, a central bank, an SEC, or here at the FCA, they've got a legitimate concern about economic stability, consumer protection, preventing money laundering, stopping terrorism finance. Those are all legitimate objectives. So it's not just a set of annoying rules. There's a purpose to them. But if you could say you could achieve those objectives, which I support and I understand, in this way, which works better for you, you'll do your job more effectively, and it works better for us because it's less onerous or it's a more future-facing way of doing it. That's how I'd do it. I mean, when I was the Chancellor, I would see the very top CEOs in the world who would come through the UK. These are the CEOs and founders of the very largest tech companies or the biggest banks or whatever. And frankly, they fell into two categories. There were those who came and told me all about their problems, which, I was a representative of the UK. I would listen politely and see if we could fix some of them. But the ones who came and said, look, I'm really interested in what your government's trying to achieve in this space, or what the G7 is trying to achieve, or the IMF, and here's how my company can help, or here's some ideas that aren't obviously self-serving for my company, but, we can contribute to. Those are the people who have real impact. And then there is, we're human beings, to your sort of second part of your question, there's just relationship building, which is seeing people, not always being transactional, seeing people again and again and building up a relationship. And of course, I know lots of people here will be the top of their business, but if there are people who are still, in the earlier stages of their career and making their way up the ranks, find your equivalents in the governments and the political systems and the regulators, because they too will kind of get to the top. Yep. And at that point, you'll have had a 10, 15 year, 20-year relationship with them, which wasn't, which was founded in kind of calmer times, and you can build on that sort of shared relationship.
Thank you. That's good. Some good advice there. I hope you don't mind bringing this up, because it was quite a long time ago. Actually, I didn't realize how long ago, but the Brexit referendum was 2016, so a number of years ago. But you clearly were not a supporter of Brexit. And earlier this year, you actually referred to it as a disaster for the UK. And I think the Labour Party leaders now say they're looking to make Brexit work rather than, sort of revisiting the issue. Do you think there's a scenario where the UK could ever re-enter the EU?
Well, I would never say never in politics.
Is it likely to?
I mean, I would never have predicted 10 years ago we'd leave the EU. But it seems quite hard to rejoin the EU. There are big obstacles. There's British public opinion, although since 2016, what it seems to show, opinion surveys, is that the public have got much more skeptical about Brexit. There's also, it'd be quite hard to imagine at the moment the EU just easily welcoming the UK back. But I don't think that's necessarily the immediate question. The question is, can we make the relationship with the EU much stronger than it is today? Because not only did we vote to leave the EU, but the way it was implemented and finally came into force in 2020, which is not that long ago, was, what was called a hard Brexit. In other words, it shattered a lot of the economic relationships, the common regulation, the common tariff, and so on. So, we left the single market, we left the customs union. And this was our collectively, the EU was our largest trading partner.
And do you think you can bring that back?
Well, I think you can reconstruct that to some, maybe not back to where it was, but a lot better than it is today. I mean, big companies, will have struggled with this, but if you're a small or medium-sized company in Britain who was used to exporting to the continent of Europe, it has become vastly more difficult, more expensive, and as a result, a lot of companies don't bother, or competitors who are within the EU have been able to outprice them and outsource them and so on. And so our trade with the European Union has gone down by more than 20%, not 2%, 20%. And of course, that's also damaging for EU exporters to the UK. We're a very big market for a lot of these economies. And I think, that was driven just by politics. You can have without relitigating the Brexit referendum and sort of trying to overturn the result, you can say when the outcome was 52% in favor of leaving and 48% in favor of remaining, maybe what the country wanted was to leave some of the political constructs of the EU, but stay in some of the economic arrangements. And I think this new government we have here in Britain, which was not a Brexit government, and the leadership were clearly in favor of remaining in the EU, have an opportunity to, we were talking about relationships earlier, kind of strike good relationships with their EU counterparts and say, come on, it's in all of our interests now, particularly when growth is hard to come by, to form a closer, better trading and services deal.
I really hope so. I think it's obviously to the benefit of us and probably everyone here. So we don't have too much time left, so a couple of things I wanted to touch on. We are seeing, certainly in our industry, a huge advancement in technology. And I guess you are in your capital business as well. So that's through, whether it's electrification, automation, artificial intelligence. So how do you think technology will impact the global supply chains? And do you see the government playing sort of a supportive role or a more regulatory role in that sort of technological change?
Well, I think I think Prologis and the people in this room will have a better insight than I do into how the technology like AI is going to change supply chains, and I'd love to hear, the views here. I think for large parts of the public sector, this technology is actually essential, because if you look at every healthcare system, every education system, it's not really performing in the way that people would want. I think the classroom experience for a school child is quite similar to the classroom, almost identical to the classroom experience I had 40 years ago, let alone maybe even 100 years ago. So how are we harnessing technology to improve the educational performance of our education systems, improve healthcare outcomes when budgets are stretched and populations are aging? It is the kind of magic bullet. I know I'm deeply skeptical generally in life of the magic wand, but to mix my metaphors, but if we can get this technology harnessed in the public sector, that'd be great. And in terms of regulating, I don't think you need a whole lot of new regulation about AI and whatever. I mean, there are already lots of rules around, make sure, that you have to get proper qualified medical professionals to give you medical advice and prescribe you drugs, and people have to be qualified teachers and so on. And in financial services, as I was saying earlier, there are a set of rules. Just apply the rules we've got. I mean, we've already established those, and do it in a way that doesn't crush the innovation.
Yep. Okay. And with something we're facing, I guess, today, certainly in our sector, in the real estate industry, we've been, facing some headwinds. So that's resulted in most companies having to tighten the purse strings. And of course, no one likes that. During your time as Chancellor, clearly you had to introduce a number of austerity measures in order to help restore the British economy. And again, I guess a lot of people didn't like that. But how do you view the balance between fiscal responsibility and making sure that there's, you're driving growth and investment in today's?
Well, I think there are two things that everyone in this audience and every citizen expects of its governments. The first is physical security. Are you safe when you walk down the street? And your borders protected? And the other thing is economic security. Are you living in a stable economic environment where you can make long-term investment decisions as an investor, or as some of the companies we work with at 9 Yards, or the boards, or a big global company like Prologis. And that means, of course, getting your debt and deficit under control. And we saw what happened 15 years ago when I was Chancellor in some of the other European countries, when they lost control of their deficits, and there was a crisis in Ireland and Greece and all sorts of other countries. And you saw it actually in the UK a couple of years ago, when there was a kind of brief moment when the markets lost confidence. So these are not theoretical problems. So controlling budgets is hard, because obviously there's huge demand on defense spending, health spending, education spending, and so on. But it's absolutely essential. And it doesn't have to be unpopular, actually. I mean, the government I was part of was re-elected. And so I think people are not stupid. Publics are not stupid. They understand the need to live within your means. They understand they're paying the taxes that fund these things. I think if it's explained to people in an adult way, even in this age of populism, if you're smart about how you present your arguments, people engage with them, and you can take a country with you.
Yep. So Tony Blair, I mean, on the topic of leadership, Tony Blair recently published a new book, and I think the quote from you was an overdue dose of optimism about how to lead in the modern world. So given the current challenges we are facing, are you optimistic about the future?
Well, I am. I know you're hearing from Tony Blair here at this conference, and what I like about him, he was my political opponent. I mean, I was like very junior and he was very senior, so I only really got my break when he cleared off. But what he brings is a reminder that, first of all, being in government's a privilege. You have all these politicians whinging about it all the time, but actually, it's a great privilege. And second, it's, for all the problems in the world, there's a lot going right. If you take a country like this one, unemployment is low. We'd like the economy to grow more than it is, but it is growing.
Yep.
There's not a financial crisis as there was. The pandemic was dealt with, albeit at a big cost. So, the world has dealt with a lot of the problems thrown at it, and even the kind of most difficult issues, like in the Middle East and Ukraine, these conflicts, terrible as they are, have not yet spilt over into some big wider world war or anything like that, God forbid.
Yeah.
So there are reasons to be optimistic that the world is kind of holding it together. And what we were talking about earlier, that we still have incredible capacity as human beings to invent things, create new technologies like artificial intelligence, which we were talking about, that are going to solve a lot of problems that previous generations couldn't solve and caused a lot of misery as a result. So I'm a big optimist. He is as well. And in the end, where does the pessimism get you?
No, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that. So just based on that optimism though, and this is the final question, what do you think are the most pressing issues facing both, global leaders from corporate and the political world? Let's say over the next decade, what do you think are going to be the key?
Well, I think there's the challenges are in the economic world. We've got largely aging populations, at least in the West, but also in China. That puts additional burdens on government budgets. And we've got to somehow get our economies more productive, which is the solution to it, rather than just endlessly cutting. I think you can do that, as I've showed, to keep the books in balance. But as a long-term solution, we've got to get these economies more productive. And that's where companies like Prologis, the companies we invest in at 9 Yards, in the startup sector, they provide the productivity solution. So the economic challenge can be summed up as productivity. There's a population movement challenge, which is really destabilizing in all of these countries, and that's around border security and immigration. There's the climate change challenge, and then there is the kind of stuff you can't ignore, which is the war and regional conflict challenge, and the nuclear weapon challenge, which doesn't get talked about much, but seems to me one of those kind of risks out there. So those are all the kind of challenges, but a lot of the solutions are also available to us. We have the global mechanisms to contain conflicts, to have dialogue between competing countries. We have technology which can solve some of the pressures on the budget. and deal with challenges to the climate and the energy transition. And we should have the cultures and the companies and the startup environment that creates the innovation that's going to solve the productivity problem. So I don't see any of these problems as insoluble. And if these problems are solved, there'll be another set of problems to come along, because that's the nature of human life and the nature of the history of the world.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time today. It's been very interesting talking to you, and thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.